Hello, I'm Ian Brannan, and welcome back to the Kielder Observatory podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe on whichever app you prefer to use to listen to your podcast so you get future episodes direct as soon as they are available. Coming up in this month's episode, we're speaking to Professor John Girkin from Durham University's Centre for Advanced Instrumentation about some of the amazing things happening both at Durham University and across the wider North East, and North East England really playing a pivotal role in Britain's space exploration programme. The Centre for Advanced Instrumentation, though, really works on some amazing things to do with optics and improving our view of the universe.
Some of the instruments or components for instruments that have been produced by the group in Durham, some of them are actually sitting on the moon now. Other components are all ready to go onto the James Webb telescope when that's eventually launched from the United States, and also in orbit around Mars on the ExoMars planet system. So we have a large involvement that goes right down from ground-based telescopes all the way up to instruments that are now going round Mars.
The work isn't just helping out in space either. They've also got involvement in a project which is helping out the research into COVID-19 too. So we'll hear more about that from Professor John Girkin very soon. First of all, though, let's have a look at what's been happening at Kielder Observatory and the things that you can look out for in the night sky over the coming weeks as well with, well, I usually call him Science Communicator Dan Pye because that was his job title. Congratulations to Dan because he's had an upgrade since our last episode. What do we call you now, and do we have to bow or kneel?
It's still me. I'm still the same. So the official title is Director of Astronomy and Science Communication.
There he is, the Director of Astronomy and Science Communication. Dan Pye joins us. Yeah. Hello, Dan. So what's been going on? Not a lot, I imagine, at the observatory itself, apart from the occasional bit of snow.
Yeah, that's it. We've been under quite some snow, actually. Every time I've looked at the webcam, it's been getting deeper and deeper and deeper.
What's the latest then? With obviously with the closures, that's ongoing until sort of the probably the middle part of March now. You'd think, but you're still hopeful.
Yeah, still hopeful. Still doing things in the background. We've still got lots of work that we're doing with schools. We're ploughing that forward. We've got lots of other smaller projects that we're working on as well. And we're working on our app at the moment. Actually, is a real big focus to what we're working on. It's currently in its testing stage, so it's going out to 500 guests who've previously visited the observatory that are on our database. They'll receive an email. And be invited to sample the app and give us some feedback on that. And then if they do, they get entered into a competition in which they could win a goodie bag of all sorts of different stuff from the observatory. So that'll be coming out to probably some of the people who are listening to this podcast. Other stuff that we've been working on as well is our digital offering and how we interact with guests away from the observatory. We're still pushing that forward and really starting to drive the change with that, and hopefully that'll be ready to roll out by maybe summertime.
The first half of February was the CPRE, the Countryside Charities Star Count, and Kielder Observatory encouraging people to get involved in that. Now, you may have missed the closing date because the official closing date is the 14th of February, but you're still being encouraged to have a look into the night sky and see how many stars you can see from where you live.
Yeah, that's right. You can go out in your garden. If you follow the link to the website on our social media, you can go. It'll give you all the information that you need in order to be able to do this. And the idea is that we're able to then build up a picture as to how much light pollution is impacting much of the UK. You need to go outside and count stars within the constellation of Orion, essentially. And the amount of stars that you can see within Orion dictate how dark your skies are. So in the Northumberland National Park, we would expect to see a lot more than what we would in the centre of Newcastle. And doing that on such a mass scale across the entire United Kingdom means that we're able to really develop a strong physical sense of data rather than just a numerical sense of data, because we have the ability to measure sky brightness, but it's better sometimes just to get that data with your eyes as well. So we're able to do that with the big star count, and it also engages kids in looking up at the sky as well.
I'll tell you what, we had a great time in our garden doing the big bird watch a few weeks ago, which was a great hit. So now you can follow on from that excitement by counting the stars in the sky above your house, wherever you are in the UK, and get involved in that, and the website with more information. Looking ahead to what's happening in February then in the night sky, what's on the agenda over the coming weeks, Dan?
February is actually quite a quiet month for astronomical things that are happening in the night sky. There's a new moon and a full moon, as there is every month. So that hasn't changed, which is a good thing, because if it did, there'd be issues.
The moon will still be there. Tick that one off. Good.
Mercury reaches its greatest western elongation in the very early stages of March 6th. It's a good hand and a half's width away from the sun. So that'll be a really good time to spot Mercury in the morning sky. So if you're an early riser and you're getting up in the morning, you might just be able to see Mercury above the horizon, which is an incredible planet to see because it's so close to the sun. And it is very, very small as well. It's one of the rarer planets that you're able to see with the naked eye. That's the biggest highlight over the next 4 weeks in your skies.
My daughter's been doing a bit about space at her reception. She's in reception year, and they've had them singing this song. And the song says that Venus is the hottest planet. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Venus is 470 degrees on its surface, or 472 degrees on its surface, much hotter than Mercury. And that sounds strange. You think
that's the crazy thing. I'm thinking, well, one that's next to the sun surely will be the hottest.
Yeah, and it's not. It's
Wow.
I mean, it's still very, very toasty on Mercury as well. One side in particular is constantly baked by the sun, and then as it spins around, because it's got no atmosphere, that heat, it just escapes into the vacuum of space, and space is of course very cold. So you end up with one side of Mercury being a good minus couple of hundred degrees, and one side of Mercury being a good plus couple of hundred degrees. So it's been baked and frozen at the same time as Mercury, which is really interesting, particularly for the geological structures that we see on Mercury. There's some incredible fault lines on Mercury, which are just insane to see the detail of. But with Venus, the reason why Venus is so unbelievably hot is because it experiences a huge greenhouse effect. It's got such a dense, thick atmosphere that traps the heat in. It can't escape. It can't go anywhere. So it just constantly heats itself up until it reaches the point which it's reaching right now. It may well have been billions of years ago a tropical paradise, but all of that greenhouse effect that's taken place over the last couple of billion years or what have you has made it a very miserable place to visit, full of volcanoes and raining sulfuric acid. And the atmosphere is so dense that if you did make it there through all of that rain and weather and all of the other misery, you would be crushed anyway, because the atmosphere is so dense it could crush you in seconds.
Just sounds like fairly heavy weekend in Blackpool gone wrong, doesn't it? It's just a very similar experience. Let's move to our Pie in the Sky feature, which was such a success last month. Let's do it again. One thing for people to look out for that maybe they didn't realise what's in the night sky. What should we look for? Dan Pie in the sky.
Let's have a look at the constellation of Leo. So there's a beautiful star in Leo, which is called Algebra. Algebra is an incredible star to see through a telescope, because although it appears as a single star, when you look at it through a telescope, it's a double. You need quite a high-powered telescope, although, in order to be able to really make out the separation between the two. But Algebra is a really cool star to see nevertheless. It's a nice bright star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo looks like, I like to think he looks like a sphinx. Across the night, a massive sphinx across the night sky is what it looks like. It's a nice constellation in itself.
That's Kielder Observatory's Director of Astronomy, that is Dan Pye, with his tip of what to look out for in the night skies this month, as and when the conditions allow. I'm Ian Brannan, this is the Kielder Observatory podcast, and our guest in this month's episode is Professor John Girkin from the Centre for Advanced Instrumentation at Durham University. Now, Dan, just give us a little overview about the sort of things that John's department has been involved with and the kind of work going on right here in the northeast.
So John's department works on some of the most incredible feats of technology that we go through in astronomy. It's always been known that astronomy and space travel has incredible technological feats which drive it forward. And one of the most exciting for me right now is an area called adaptive optics. It allows us to use our big ground-based telescopes and almost delete our atmosphere, see straight through our atmosphere. And at Durham University, they're producing some of the most incredible pieces of kit which enable us to be able to do that with immense accuracy. It's one of the most fantastic leaps forward in technology. And it means that we can get a view of the universe like never before. I mean, we've seen images such as the Hubble Deep Field, which are incredible high-resolution images of our night sky, so much so that we're able to see galaxies on the very edge of our visible universe with 39-metre telescopes, which is the biggest telescope in construction right now. Applying that adaptive optics system to a telescope such as that, when the one that was really good before was only 2.5 metres in diameter, you can imagine the resolution that we're going to be able to get with something like this is just mind-boggling. And that's some of the stuff that's being worked on by Durham University right now, and which John is going to talk to us about.
You're listening to the Kielder Observatory podcast. Welcome along. I'm Ian Brannan, and it's my great pleasure to welcome from Durham University's Centre for Advanced Instrumentation, it is Professor John Girkin. Thanks for joining us, John. Do you want to start, first of all, by telling us, firstly, a bit more about your department and the work that you do?
Yes, so I'm actually the Professor of Biophysics at Durham, but I run the group that makes advanced instrumentation, which are instruments, optically based instruments that get fitted onto telescopes around the world, but also now increasingly miniature optics or miniature devices, small high performance devices that can get integrated into satellites, both large satellites and increasingly towards the smaller cube satellites, where one rocket can launch multiple small satellites which then get put into orbit around the Earth or sent further afield as well. And on those, the instrumentation is complex, but it has to be small and compact. So we're moving down and taking our instruments along those directions. And in fact, some of the instruments or components for instruments that have been produced by the group in Durham, some of them are actually sitting on the moon now. Other components are all ready to go onto the James Webb telescope when that's eventually launched from the United States, and also in orbit around Mars on the ExoMars planet system. So we have a large involvement that goes right down from ground-based telescopes all the way up to instruments that are now going round Mars.
And on ExoMars, in our previous episode, we spoke all about ExoMars and the next stage of that, which is to put a lander on the moon and hopefully look for signs of life. But that mission began a number of years ago, and you're heavily involved in that, and that is a mission to look for the different gases, isn't it, around in the atmosphere around Mars?
Yes, so one of the focuses of the group that I run is doing spectroscopy, where you look at the light that's either being transmitted or given off from a planet or through a planet's atmosphere. And then by looking at the different wavelengths of light, you can determine what the atmosphere actually consists of, what its pressure, what the density of various materials are that are present in the atmosphere. So we have these spectroscopic systems, high precision spectroscopic systems, systems that operate all the way from the ultraviolet, so very short wavelengths of light, all the way up into the infrared, long heat based wavelengths of light. So we can analyze the light that comes down, look at it in some detail on the small spectroscopic instruments that are built into the satellites, and then that gives you a great understanding of what's present within the atmosphere of the moons or the planets.
I'm sure I'm not the only one who's quite surprised as to just how staggering the work is that's going on in the Northeast, and what a pivotal role the Northeast has in helping out space exploration on distant planets such as Mars. And how did the Northeast and how did Durham University come to be in this position to be so pivotal in space exploration?
So Durham University has always played and had a large astronomy unit, and particularly this was led by Sir Arnold Wolfendale, who unfortunately died very recently. But he was the astronomer royal and started, and he looked for particles. But this led to a growth in astronomy, both people who analyze the data, make predictions, build universes in computers, all the way through to actually making the instruments that actually then enable you to put facts and details into these models that are being developed. So Durham as a university has this broad spectrum, right from the very detailed theoretical cosmology all the way through to building an instrument with optical fibers that then go into a spectrometer where you look at the wavelengths of light, enabling people to search for dark matter. So this has grown up over a long period of time within Durham, and we are recognised as being one of the leading universities within Europe and indeed around the world for astronomy. And what has grown on the back of this is then this ability to make instruments, and this is then becoming a focus within the Northeast, where, yes, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you needed a very large infrastructure to build satellites. Now the satellites are smaller, and by collaborating with people around the world, our instruments and our components can then get put into these satellites. And this is now forming a focus within the Northeast to actually grow on the back of this for precision instruments that are space related, and the associated then aspect of processing the data that comes back from such satellites, whether they're just orbiting the Earth or going round Mars.
And we've talked about Mars, and Great Britain is building the lander that is going to hopefully find signs of life on Mars in the next few years. Would it be fair to say that now is probably one of the best times ever for Britain being involved in any kind of space exploration, and very exciting for anybody who's looking to get further involved in this, maybe take it up as a career or study it further, and particularly in Durham? We've got lots going on and lots going for us, haven't we?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I think there are different aspects of it as well, and I've thought about this. So this is going to give some clues away as to my age. But when I was growing up, I would play with models on my parents' lounge floor while I was watching the astronauts exploring the moon. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting there, personally, it wasn't so much the astronomy aspect of it, it was the exploration, and in my case the instruments that they were using, that stimulated my interest in physics, that I then went on to study it at university, and then I've ended up in the position that I'm in now. So as well as looking at the pure, if you like, theoretical, or the trying to understand how the universe forms, there are the other aspects of it as well, the instruments, the satellites, the communication with those satellites now, all the way down to miniature components that go into such instruments. So I think that one of the wonderful things about astronomy in general is it can look and stimulate people at all levels, whether it's thinking about these really big pictures down to very practical miniature engineering challenges.
And tell us about some of the projects you're involved in at the moment, because you've got plenty of things on the go at the minute, right the way from assisting with searching for dark matter to the fight against COVID. It's a fair spread.
Yes, so we within the centre we build instruments, and I'll sort of start at the top end and then work down if you like. So the instruments that are built in Durham, we have a special facility out at Sedgefield at Net Park where the instruments are assembled and very often put together. These may be components. So one of the things that's been done recently is a multiple miniature optical fibres. So these are the fibres that we normally think about carrying our communications around the world on. But here they're being used, put at the focus of a telescope. The fibres are then fed into spectrometers where the light, the wavelength of the light that we've been looking at is broken down and examined. And in particular, we've just delivered a very large bundle of fibres, so multiple fibre cables, where each one of those cables contains over 5,000 individual optical fibres, all with miniature lenses on the end of it, and these have been installed and are now being used in a program called DESI, which is looking a dark matter survey. So this is now on a telescope in America, and it's being used for exploring the universe to see if there is any dark matter. And the results that come back from this instrument, one of the places that they're being analysed is actually back in Durham. So in this case, we've built a vital component for the telescope all the way back to now processing the data from that. And this has been a sort of strong focus of the research that's taking place within Durham. It's not just building the instrument, it's developing the demand, understanding what you want to look at within the universe, then how do you build an instrument that can be put on a telescope or launched into space, and then processing the results that come back. So we also have instruments, novel spectrometers that are on the South African Large Telescope, the Subaru Telescope, and also here a thing called CAMOS, and these are very precise spectrometers that are specifically set up to look at small wavelength regions of light on telescopes. Clearly there are engineering challenges there, because as the telescope moves round, you don't want all the fibre optic cables winding themselves up. No. So we otherwise the telescope will just spin back round in the other direction. So and clearly a telescope tips, and there are occasionally part of your instrument may have to go upside down. So the engineering challenges in making these things and being really efficient, because every photon of light that you've collected, you want to use it as efficiently as possible. You don't want it being lost in your optical fibres. So we really worry about the throughput and getting everything really precise. So that's the spectrometers, and then it goes down to some of the components that we were talking about earlier. We have out in Durham one of the most advanced optics manufacturing facilities in the UK and indeed in Europe, where we can use a so-called diamond machining. So this is it's a lathe, or it's a 5-axis machine where we can plot onto a metallic surface using a diamond tip virtually any shape you want. So we can make on these 5-axis machines, which cost about £500,000 each. The machine, the metal part, that we're machining goes round perhaps 100,000 times a minute. And the diamond tip comes in, and you machine directly onto the metallic surface a mirror, or you can put a grating which will break the light down into its individual components. And because it's been machined on metal, these are very, very solid, very robust. But you can also 3D print the metal, so some of the metal is hollow, so that when you then machine the surface, you've made a very high precision, lightweight component. And to give an idea of the accuracy, we can machine these surfaces to a few nanometers, so 1/100th of the wavelength of light. And that is as precise as you can get by mechanically grinding something, which is the traditional way of making optics. But crucially here, as I said, we can make basically any shape. So most optical components traditionally are spherical because they're made by polishing. We can make so-called aspheric surfaces, which means that very often the aberrations, the distortion in the image that you will get through any optical system, we can shape the material that actually removes that distortion, so instead of having to make a lens or an optical system with multiple elements in it, we can reduce the number of elements down, because each of those elements can help in itself to remove the overall aberrations of the instrument. And it's these metallic machined components that are in the James Webb telescope that's going to be launched, as I said, and also now orbiting Mars or sitting on the moon.
And we mentioned this ELT, the Extremely Large Telescope, and you mentioned about the lasers being used there to calibrate the aberrations. And there's an artist's impression of this telescope, the one in Chile, and it's got these lasers firing out of it. It does look like something out of a science fiction movie. It looks quite incredible. And this is going to be actually open and working, hopefully, by 2024.
Yes, its first light is supposed to be 2024, and one of the instruments that will be used on the first light that comes through the telescope, again, Durham is involved in building part of the components of that. Yes, they make beautiful, spectacular pictures, where in the case, those are artists' impression, because that big telescope's going to be using over 8 lasers to create 8 artificial guide stars, because the aperture of the telescope is so big, we need to correct at different points across the image. But even now, telescopes in the Canary Islands have lasers on them. Typically, these only have a single laser, which, as I said, is either orange to light up the sodium, or you can actually use a green laser, which actually you then look at light that's scattered back from the atmosphere and pick it up. Yes, it does look very spectacular. They are also very high power lasers, so you have to worry. There's various safety precautions that have to take place, and they also have to keep aircraft away from that area. Not that it would destroy an aircraft, but that amount of laser power going into an aircraft would not be good for any of the people that are inside it.
I'd heard a rumour about these lasers, and I want to verify the rumour right now, actually, if I can, because you're going to know the answer. But I've heard that they are capable of popping pigeons. Is that correct, or are these not that powerful?
Oh, I think they would take a pigeon out without any problem at all.
These extreme.
These are large, high power, so they're over 100 watts. They're relatively large in diameter, but yes, you would not want to be a bird flying into one of them.
Yeah, and that's why they're building it
amazing.
in a remote location north of Chile and not in Trafalgar Square.
Yes, that's one of the reasons. Yes, most telescopes are now built at about 10,000 feet, 3,000, 4,000 meters. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, you've then removed a significant portion of the atmosphere. The other thing, of course, that we all know about, even when you're looking through a telescope at home, is you want to do it with a dark sky. And therefore, building a telescope either in the middle of the desert on the top of a Chilean mountain, there is not a lot of other buildings around there, so the sky is really very dark, which of course is actually one of the advantages of Kielder as well. We are in a very dark part of the United Kingdom.
As we've been talking about, the Northeast is very much at the centre of Britain's space programme, and it must be very handy to have such a great facility as Kielder Observatory nearby as well to help further your research and for Kielder to get the benefit of your knowledge as well. Tell us a bit more about the partnership between Durham University and Kielder Observatory.
So this is actually something that the university is, and I know Kielder are looking to grow. So we have some of the expertise that we have within our group goes up and services the instruments up at Kielder to make sure that they're performing at the peak of their quality. And we're also looking now to say, so you capture a picture with a star of a star that's really very interesting. But as I was talking about earlier, what you really want to be able to do is to actually look at the individual wavelengths of light and things like that. So we're looking at ways that we can actually take instruments that have been developed for these very large telescopes around the world and consider, is there a way of actually applying this to some of the Kielder telescopes to try and give spectroscopic capability, which then means that you can actually do serious state-of-the-art science with these telescopes, as well as encouraging people to look at the wonders of the universe.
It's been the case probably since space exploration began that the discoveries that are made help us out here on Earth in other ways too. And that's true for some of the things that you've discovered and some of the things that you've created at Durham University as well, isn't it?
There's always the comment made, particularly in what may be the sort of coming financial challenges that have been set by COVID, is you say, well, you're building these astronomical instruments, that's all very good, but what else can they capable of doing? So personally, I actually take a lot of this technology that has been designed and built for astronomy and then actually begin to apply it, if you like, down on Earth in a more everyday manner. So, for example, one of the things that I personally am involved in is using the adaptive optics on a microscope. It's actually the same challenge that you have in a telescope, except it's not quite as dynamic. But as you image deeply with a microscope, you have to look through the sample. That aberrates the image that you're looking at, exactly in the same way that we were talking about the atmosphere doing for starlight. So personally, we're looking at building these adaptive optics into microscopes that we've already done, and actually taking also some of the optical fiber technology that I talked about and integrating that into instruments. We do actually have one that's in a clinical use at the moment up in Edinburgh, which is being looked at and used on COVID patients to examine what's actually happening. So I think part of here is building up these new instruments that are going to go on these very large, very expensive telescopes to help us to understand the universe and the dynamics that are taking place there, all the way through to actually taking that technology and using it for other applications. So this is an area that's of growing importance. And the final comment I would say is also trying to communicate with satellites. One of the challenges that we are putting more and more satellites up, some of them large satellites around the Earth, and taking the data, so we can now take high resolution images with lots of spectroscopic information, lots of wavelength information in there, and these images then become very, very large, and we have to get the data off the satellite and down onto Earth. And of course, the way we move data around on Earth now, it's all done by light through optical fibers. Clearly, again, we can't run an optical fiber up to a satellite, but the idea that we could actually use light propagating through the atmosphere to take data off the satellites is an area that we're also looking at. Clearly, if we're taking the data off we need the light to be collected very efficiently, so we are then back to our adaptive optics. So the idea that we can also then take the adaptive optics that we've put onto telescopes and use them for communicating with satellites going around the Earth to pull off all that information. Those are probably in areas that will be of growth in the near future.
Just like to ask about CubeSats, actually, because I don't really know, admittedly, I don't really know a massive amount about CubeSats and what their capabilities are, but I've heard about the possibilities of smaller projects, smaller businesses getting involved in launching small satellites into space, and also schools launching satellites into space as well. And I just wondered if you had any comments on any of that.
I think it's clearly a rapidly emerging field. I mean, one of the challenges has always been that if you're going to put a satellite up into space, you would put a single relatively large satellite onto a rocket and launch it up. And that was clearly always going to be very, very expensive, even if you just consider the testing, because if you put all the instruments into a satellite and you've launched a rocket with a single satellite in it, it has to work. And therefore it's very expensive, very complex to do all the testing. Now that you can put multiple satellites onto reusable rockets, which can go up and push them around, then you are looking at these smaller satellites, and even there's CubeSats and there's smaller things than that. So satellites that are let's say a cubic meter or less in size. And if you've launched a multiple number from a single rocket launch, if one of them doesn't work, it's clearly annoying, but it's not really fatal and too expensive. So the idea is that it then becomes very much easier for companies, or exactly as you said, schools potentially, to be involved, building an instrument, putting it onto a satellite where the testing does not need to be as extensive or as complex as it is at the moment. And it may also be that the instrument on it may need to last for, let's say, matters of weeks and months rather than years, which again means the components can be of lower cost, lower specification. So this is clearly an area that is going to become increasingly important, and is one that small companies or smaller companies or schools can get actively involved in, because the startup costs are not as large as having to be a large multinational aerospace company to launch your satellite.
Can you imagine that? I mean, it's just the type of the stuff that you can experience in education now as a kid. If I was told when I was a kid, oh, today we're going to work on launching a satellite into space, that would just be such an incredible thing to do from an academic point of view in schools. It would be so inspiring, I think, for them.
It comes back to my earlier comment, why am I doing what I'm doing? Okay, I personally am not building instruments that are going onto satellites or instruments that are going onto large telescopes, but it was this interest in my case in the moon landings, and clearly now it's possible to engage with these satellites that are going up and be actively involved with them. Yes, the opportunities there to encourage people to become involved are huge. And if we can motivate people to look in these sort of areas, I'm all in favour of that.
It just astounds me that we have all of this stuff happening in the northeast on our doorsteps, and the significance of the work that's been done as well. And when you think about the northeast of England, I think much of the rest of the country isn't thinking, you know what, they're leading the way in some of the most impactful research in astronomy on the planet. It's just such an under I don't want to say underappreciated, but under talked about area of stuff that we do in the northeast.
And we've had instrument companies that have built telescopes in the past, so there is actually a slightly longer tradition that goes back in this area of optics. Sometimes they were used for military sites, but often they were used for astronomy. So there is a greater historical record when you go back as well.
It's really interesting when you Google adaptive optics as well. There's a very significant image I remember seeing from the VLT, which was an image of, I think it was Neptune, pre the adaptive optics, then post adaptive optics, and then a comparison with Hubble, and the difference that it makes to install adaptive optics on these systems is phenomenal.
Oh yes, so now, particularly because the telescopes that you have on Earth have a larger aperture, which means you get inherently higher resolution images if it weren't for the atmosphere. So when you remove the aberrations that are present in the atmosphere, it means that you can actually now get better images from ground-based telescopes than you can from the Hubble Space Telescope. And the James Webb Telescope is particularly being optimized for looking at wavelengths which don't get transmitted by the atmosphere, because things like the ELT in Chile we were talking about earlier, that will give you phenomenally high resolution images, very sensitive images, providing you've removed the atmospheric turbulence.
Well, thanks for joining us, Professor John Girkin from Durham University. And it's been hugely enlightening to find out just how much stuff is going on in the Northeast and how exciting it all is as well to be playing such a key role in Britain's space programme and helping out so many other nations around the world as well, and even involvement on Mars right here from the Northeast. It's amazing to hear, and thanks for telling us about it.
That's the reason that we do these things like this. Yeah, it's right. It is something that's very often understated around here. It carries on in its own in its own right, but we're playing part in the whole world, and we're probably sometimes recognised across in the whole world more than we might be locally, which sounds a real strange aspect, but I think this can happen. The role that the UK plays, and again coming down locally plays, is it becoming increasingly obvious, and there are opportunities for everyone to become involved in this.
And our thanks to Professor John Girkin from Durham University's Centre for Advanced Instrumentation for joining us on today's podcast.
Super interesting. I love that kind of stuff. Adaptive optics is amazing, honestly. It's so clever. It blows my mind.
Yeah, it was mind-blowing, the stuff that they're up to. And if you want to find out more, by the way, you can head to the Durham University website. And if you look for the Centre for Advanced Instrumentation, you'll find all the latest news from their department as and when it arrives. My thanks to Dan Pye.
Thank you.
And don't forget, for more information on Kielder Observatory, all the latest can be found by looking on our website, which is kielderobservatory.org. And you can follow us on social media too. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're on them all. Look out for Kielder Observatory, and as soon as there's any news, it'll be straight into your newsfeed. And likewise with this podcast, if you hit subscribe, as soon as there's a new episode, it'll drop straight into your player of choice. We'll be back next month, March 2021, where hopefully we'll have news of maybe being able to reopen if we keep our fingers crossed and, feel the seaweed in the right way. Here's hoping. Take care in the meantime and enjoy the night sky. Thanks a lot.